Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read about Antebellum America by Mary Kelley, Learning to Stand and Speak, Women Education and Public Life in America's Republic. Women Thinking, Margaret Fuller's Conversations in Context. Margaret Fuller and those gathered around her would have looked askance to readers who severed books from the conversations they engendered. They would have resisted a hierarchy and the subordinating reading to reform, and had they been forced to do so, they would not have hesitated in choosing between these enterprises. Books came before benevolence for the women whom Fuller invited to collaborate on an ambitious undertaking, systemizing and interrogating fundamental bodies of knowledge. Members of the female elite in Boston and in its environs, the women who accepted Fuller's invitation were drawn at least as strongly to the woman as to the project she envisioned. Already widely known in the antebellum world of letters, Fuller had published essays of literature, criticism, translations of German intellectuals, and reviews of contemporary literature, music, and art. During the 7 years in which the conversations were held, she completed Summer of the Lakes, a volume describing the travels west in 1843 and conceived women in the 19th century, published in 1845, and taking much of its shape from the collective arts of interpretation into which she and the members of the conversations engaged this defense of woman's equality, made Fuller famous then and now. Unless independently wealthy, almost all of antebellum Americans who pursued careers in the world of letters had to support themselves by other means. Fuller chose teaching. In the fall of 1836, she assumed two positions: teaching German, French, and Italian literature to young women in Boston, and Latin, French, and Italian languages to children at Bronson Alcott's coeducational Temple School. In a departure from the pedagogy applied at nearly all schools, whatever the level of education, Alcott modeled the practice in Socratic dialogue in the exclusion of rote learning and resuscitation. Although Alcott's pedagogy might have not have been all that controversial, his interpretations of Scripture was excoriated after the publication of his Conversations with Children in the Gospels of 1836 and 37. The controversy in the school's plummeting enrollments bankrupted the founder and left the partner without a salary. Fuller's next position took her to Providence, Rhode Island in 1837 at the Green Street School, classes filled with young women from 18 to 20, intelligent and earnest, attracted by our own renown, who had joined the school for more advanced culture. This was just what I wanted, she told Caroline Sturgis in January 1838. Fuller schooled her students in the curriculum teachers and principals of female academies and seminaries had installed throughout the United States. However, the lessons were stamped with the pedagogy she had had practice at Alcott School. Fuller instructed female students to shun memorization and instead, as one noted, to get our lessons by mind, to give our minds and souls to the work. The typical emphasis on daily resuscitation was subordinating to collective acts of interpretation. It is all talk, said Mary Ware Allen, who explained Fuller's reasoning. She says we must think and as well as study and talk as well as recite. Fuller called her students to approach their learning through the cultivation of their mental faculties, activity of mind, accuracy in processes, constant looking for principles and search for any good and beautiful, as she explained to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Although Fuller expected her students to apply these these principles, to all the books they read in their classes, she singled out Francis Wayland's Elements of Moral Science, published 3 years before Fuller assigned it to 1838. Wayland's Elements was already beginning to rival in popularity William Paley's Principles of Mind and Political Philosophy. The precepts of Wayland's moral philosophy, Fuller told her students, would lay upon our minds like a dry husk unless they take root sufficiently deep to produce one little thought of our own. In thinking through and beyond Wayland, Fuller's students took the same approach as their counterparts at Brown, who were enrolled in the author's course in moral philosophy. Meeting daily to grapple with the implications of the lecture, Wayland students acted in parallel with Fuller students who were sitting in their classroom only blocks away from Brown, and using the elements of moral science as a point of departure, rather than an end in itself. Fuller anticipated that the woman she instructed might do more than the students at Brown. They might well take on their own contributions to moral philosophy by articulating something entirely original. Instilling in those, she taught the dual claim of public voice and intellectual authority. Fuller committed her students to lives of social and cultural consequence. She spoke upon the woman could do. She said she would like to see a woman everything she might be in intellect and character. Mary Ware Allen remarked in a journal she kept during the year she spent at Green Street School, the students in Fuller's classroom were taught by example. Fuller selected many of the models that teachers at female academies and seminaries have been asking their charges to emulate since Sarah Pierce had introduced Hannah More to her students in the late 18th century. These exemplars had the same impact on Green Street students, and as entry to the Journal of Evelina Metcalf shows, as she learned to listen to Fuller describe a woman who had succeeded as a sculptor, Metcalf declared, "It makes me proud when I hear such things as this, for it shows that our sex is capable of doing and encouraging us to go on improving." According to her students, Fuller herself was a model. The teacher was an incomparable woman, as Louise Hunt remarked to Lucy Clark Ware Allen. She was a perfect wonder, Anna Gale told her brother Frederick when a student at Harvard. It was learning that Gale most admired. "I almost stand in awe of her. She is such a literary being." Although Fuller took satisfaction from the impact she had on students, the demands of teaching made it insufficiently difficult for her to remain, as Gale described her, such a literary being. In the spring of 1838, she told Emerson that she could not sustain both a worldly and a literary existence, making clear her preference for the latter. But as she admitted to him, "I keep on fulfilling all my duties, as the technical phrase is expected to myself." 9 months later, Fuller placed herself first, resigning the position of Green Street School and focus on her literary career. Within 2 months, she had completed a translation of Meditations recorded by Ghost's secretary. Shortly thereafter, she agreed to edit the newly established Dial, a transcendentalist journey of essays and poetry. Translating Goethe and editing the Dial enhanced Fuller's standing in the world of letters. Neither brought an income, however. In the summer of 1839, she returned to teaching, albeit in the less formal setting. The site was the Conversations, which was held at Elizabeth Peabody's bookshop in West Street in Boston. In the next 5 years, Fuller and her female disciples addressed Greek mythology and historical development in the fine arts and contemporary definitions of masculinity and femininity. The subject of woman's intellectual potential figured at all of these discourses, taking virtually the same position as Sarah Joseph Hale and Catherine Beecher. Fuller suggested that although women and men had the same mental attributes, they had been combined in different proportions, in contrast to Hale and Beecher, who implied that the difference was inherent. However, Fuller maintained that there was no essential difference, it was only more or less. Did the participants of the Conversations agree? Fuller asked. Did they describe to the opinion that the differences they had observed were grounded in gender conversations? Fuller's rhetorical questions had revolutionary implications. It would follow, of course, that we should hear no more of repressing or subduing faculties because they were not fit for women to cultivate. The radical individualism driving Fuller's insistence that a woman could design for herself the manner in which she cultivated her faculties liberated all women from the restriction imposed by prevailing gender conventions. Women could now look upon their intellectual potential as a principle of our perfection and cultivate it accordingly, and not excuse ourselves from any duty on the ground that we have not the intellectual powers for it. For it was not for women to do in an intellectual ground, in privileging intellectual equality rather than the moral superiority. Fuller took the same position as members of the post-revolutionary female elite who had emphasized that the reasoning and rhetorical capacities of women and men were exactly alike. In posting sameness instead of difference, Fuller set forth an alternative to the antecedent model of the morally superior woman who made the redemption of the nation her particular obligation. Fuller instead of modeled the intellectual equal woman who was able to pursue intellectual opportunity as well as social duty, Whatever the topic of conversations, Fuller's colleagues were dazzled by their leader's ability to gather threads from disparate sources and weave them together in a tapestry of larger meaning. I never heard, read of, or imagined a conversation at all equal to this we have now heard, one participant exulted as she conveyed the sense of the gatherings. As with her students at Green Street School, Fuller's example had the most powerful effect of those with whom she engaged in the conversations. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who attended a series during the winter she spent in Boston, supplies one illustration. After she had returned to her home in Western New York, Stanton inaugurated meetings of imitation of Margaret Fuller's conversationals. Stanton also invoked Fuller's spirit in the first speech she delivered after Seneca Falls. Then fear not thou to wind the horn, Stanton told her listeners. Endless her address with the poem of Fuller's that appeared on the final page of Woman in the 19th Century. Stanton remembered the conversations Fuller led as a vindication of women's rights to think. Fuller herself was pleased with the enterprise, which had served her well for several reasons. Shortly after the conversations had begun, Fuller told her friend, Sarah Helen Whitman, that there I have real society, which I have not before looked for out of the pale of intimacy, beyond the mutually devoted friendship that connected her to other women. The conversations validated Fuller as a model of woman thinking and replicated the model among other participants in answering what we were born to do, and then how shall we do it? Fuller activated the process of self-actualization and social emancipation. The conversations then provided Fuller with a community in which she could realize the claim that she would make on behalf of woman thinking in her manifesto, Woman in the 19th Century. Although the conversations are the most renowned in the antebellum reading circles, the gathering Fuller organized with a small courtier was only one of the many collaborations taking place throughout the country in cities and towns and schools and spinning mills. Women who were still being educated at female academies and seminaries and who had completed their schooling found hundreds of these organizations. In these settings, women apprenticed themselves for roles for makers of public opinion, engaged in critical thought and cultural production, polishing reasoning in rhetorical facilities and deploying the vocabularies and values of civil society. They practiced the art of persuasive self-presentation. These women taught themselves to stand and speak. As Lucy Stone described their self-transformation, and in doing so, prepared themselves to transform civil society into the communities, their regions, and in cases such as Fuller's, their nation. Thus ends the moral lesson of today of Mrs. Fuller's Learning to Stand and Speak, of conversations with Margaret Fuller. So you think there's any truth in like what I'm saying to modern society, how we're still being controlled by the media and the press and all the lies that they tell us every day? Keep listening to their lies and have a nice day.